Welcome to the podcast, Stories from the World of Science. Our mission is to explain science in a simple and fun form that is open to all.
All right, so you sent in this article, and you don't hear about this every day. We're going to be diving into the world of beer.
Okay.
And statistics.
That was good.
You might be thinking those two don't really go together.
Right.
But that's what makes this deep dive so interesting.
Yeah.
You sent in this article about William Sealy Gosset. He was a brewer at Guinness who kind of changed how we think about data.
Yeah, it's one of those great examples of when you solve a problem in your everyday life and it has these huge ripple effects far beyond just the initial problem you were looking at.
Yeah.
Wanting to make consistent beer led to a statistical revolution.
Exactly. So picture this. It's the late 1800s. Guinness, they're killing it, right? They're shipping this beer all over the world. But how do you make sure that every single pint from Dublin to Delhi tastes the same?
Yeah, that was a huge challenge for them. They're scaling up. They had to find a way to maintain that signature taste, even with, as production's going through the roof.
Yeah.
And it's part of this larger trend that was happening at the time, right? Yeah. This move towards like standardized measurements and analysis in a lot of different fields, science and industry.
Right. And, back then brewers, they pretty much just used their senses.
Yeah.
Sight, smell, taste.
Right.
And you can imagine how that could get kind of tricky when you're producing on a mass scale.
Oh, yeah. And not the most reliable, considering how subjective all those things are. One brewer's, perfect flavor is not necessarily the same for the next person.
Right. Absolutely. So they needed a more like foolproof method.
Totally.
And that's where William Sealy Gosset comes into play.
Yeah.
And this guy, he wasn't just your average brewer. He was a mathematician and a chemist.
Wow.
So Guinness, they knew what they were doing by bringing this guy on.
Absolutely. That's a great example of, just the power of having diverse backgrounds and people tackling a problem.
Right.
Sometimes the most creative solutions come from connecting ideas from totally different fields. And that's definitely the case with Gosset.
Right. So his task was to figure out how to analyze all of their ingredients. And mainly we're talking about barley and hops, right? To make sure that they were, good to go.
Yeah.
But they couldn't analyze every grain and every shipment. That would just take way too long.
Right. That's where things get really interesting because he's wrestling with this question of how much can we trust a small sample? Can we take a small sample size of something and have that be representative of the whole?
Yeah. And that's a problem not just with beer, right? As this article pointed out, researchers in all sorts of fields, they struggle with this, trying to draw conclusions, from sometimes limited data.
Totally. Yeah. And what he was doing was really pioneering this field of small sample statistics, which was a revolutionary concept. Before him, people really thought you needed these massive data sets to draw any sort of meaningful conclusions.
Interesting. So how did he bridge that gap between, these small samples and getting these reliable results?
That's where the t-test comes in. It's a way to look at the data and tell if the differences you're seeing are meaningful or if it's just random chance.
Okay. So can you break that down for me a little bit?
Sure. So imagine you're flipping a coin, right? And you flip it, say, 10 times.
Yeah.
And you get heads 7 out of those 10 times. Does that mean the coin is rigged?
Maybe.
Right. Maybe you just got lucky.
Yeah.
The t-test basically helps answer that. It tells you how likely it is to get that result, 7 out of 10 heads, if the coin was actually fair. And if it's really unlikely, then you might start to think, maybe something's up with this coin.
Okay.
So he's applying that same logic to the barley.
I see.
He can look at a small sample, and as long as he's factoring in that possibility of random variation, he can get a pretty good idea of, what that whole batch is like, which was a revolutionary idea. But there's another twist. This article you sent, you know how Guinness was? Like, super secretive back then.
Yeah, I remember that. Like Gosset, he even published all of his work under student. That was like his pseudonym. Why all the secrecy?
Right. Well, back then, companies like Guinness, they guarded their methods very, very closely, right?
Right.
And they saw Gosset's work as a trade secret.
Sure.
This is something that gave them a competitive advantage.
Of course.
Publishing under a fake name basically allowed him to share his findings with other scientists without revealing all the Guinness's secrets.
Right. I mean, it makes sense, but it's kind of ironic when you think about it because his statistical method it ended up having a way bigger impact than any brewing secret probably ever could.
You're absolutely right. It just goes to show, sometimes these big breakthroughs, they can come from the most unexpected places.
Right.
Speaking of which, I kind of want to shift gears a little bit here and talk about how this beer-inspired statistical method is used today. Because it's not just brewers using this anymore.
No kidding. The article mentioned medicine, social sciences, like it's everywhere.
You name it, it's probably there. And for good reason.
Yeah.
It helps us make sense of the data and draw meaningful conclusions in a world that's just overflowing with information these days. But before we do that, I think we kind of need to unpack the t-test a little bit more, right?
Okay.
It's one thing to sort of understand it conceptually, but actually seeing it in action, I think, will really drive the point home.
Okay, yeah, I'm on board. Let's break it down even further. Okay, so we've established this t-test is this powerful tool to analyze data, but is there a way we can kind of see it in action? I think that would help me and maybe the listener too.
Totally. Let's say a group of scientists are they're testing out a new drug.
Okay.
And it's designed to lower blood pressure. So they have two groups. One group gets the new drug and the other group gets the placebo, right? This is the control group.
Right. Makes sense. So they wait a while and then they measure the blood pressure of, of both groups. And then are they trying to see if there's a difference in how they responded?
Exactly. And that's where the t-test comes in.
Yeah.
They would then, they'd analyze the data from both groups and determine if that difference in blood pressure is statistically significant.
So meaning it's not just a, random fluke.
Right. Exactly. Think about it this way. Even if the drug did absolutely nothing, you'd probably still see some just natural variation in blood pressure between those two groups.
Right, because everyone's different.
Exactly.
Some people just have higher or lower blood pressure naturally.
Right. The t-test basically takes all that into account.
Okay.
And tells you how likely is it that we'd see this difference even if the drug didn't work.
Gotcha.
So if it's a very low probability, then the researchers, they have some evidence to say, like, okay, this drug, this is probably having a real effect.
Right, because it's not just, oh, well, this group, their blood pressure went down, so it must be the drug. You're backing it up with this analysis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's really why, the test test, it was really revolutionary because it allowed, it gave scientists a tool to be much more confident about their conclusions.
Right.
Even with these smaller sample sizes.
Which, like we were saying before, I mean, that was kind of a big deal.
Huge.
Because before, everyone thought you needed just tons and tons of data.
Right.
To even really look at anything.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of amazing to think about just this one brewer trying to improve the consistency of his beer, and it ends up, changing how we do research in all these different fields.
It really is. Medicine,
Psychology, economics, like you name it.
Yeah, it kind of makes you wonder what other simple solutions are out there just waiting to have their, t-test moment.
That's a great question. But it also brings up, I think, a really important point. If this statistical tool, if it's used everywhere, shouldn't everyone have like a basic understanding of how it works?
Yeah, especially today. When you think about just how much information's out there. I mean, every news headline, every social media post, advertisements, like they all throw statistics at us.
Time, yeah. And not all of them are created equal, right?
Right.
So having even this basic grasp of these concepts, like the test, it allows you to be a more critical consumer of information.
So the next time I see a headline that says, study shows coffee makes you live longer, I shouldn't just take that as fact.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily dismiss it out of hand, but yeah. I mean, you're thinking along the right lines.
Yeah.
Right? Ask those questions. How big was the study? Who conducted it? Did they use a control group? And how do they analyze the data?
Right. Like you have this built-in BS detector for statistics. You're not just passively taking in information. You're actually thinking about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Analytically.
Which is more important than ever.
I agree.
In this world of data.
Totally. I mean, it's like that saying, figures don't lie, but liars can figure.
That's a good one.
So understanding those tools can help us kind of separate those things.
Oh, sure.
It's like this secret decoder ring for, for the information age.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yep.
It's not about, becoming statisticians overnight.
Right.
It's about having that awareness so you can ask the right questions and think about the data.
Yeah.
Critically.
Absolutely. But, there's this other interesting part, this whole Guinness secrecy thing that I think ties into this idea of information control.
Yeah.
You ready for another twist in the story?
Oh, yeah.
Lay it on me. Yeah.
So what's this extra layer about Guinness's secrecy?
Well, think about it. Back then, Guinness was worried about their competitors getting this information, right?
Right.
But it wasn't just companies that understood, the power of statistics, governments, powerful entities.
Right.
They've always,
Of course.
they've always known
both
how to, kind of use it to their advantage, but also how to keep it away from others. Are you saying that back then, just understanding data was like a secret weapon?
In a way, yeah. The ability to collect it, analyze it, control that information, huge advantage.
Right.
And on the flip side, if you could, suppress that information, you could really influence a lot of things.
Wow.
Public perception, decision-making.
So Gosset's work, this wasn't just about making beer better. It was really about giving people the ability to understand the world around them.
Exactly. And I think that's why it's so relevant today.
Yeah.
We're just surrounded by data.
Right.
Constantly. And it's used in all sorts of ways. Some good, some not so good.
Yeah. And we talked about, how this contest can help us spot those misleading statistics. But can you give us an example of how that actually works in the real world?
Oh, absolutely. Think about, political campaigns. They might pick and choose data to make it seem like everyone's on their side. Or marketing campaigns, right? They use all these statistics to get you to buy something, even when there's not a lot of evidence to back it up.
It's like they say, there are lies, damned lies, and statistics. But if you understand the tools behind them, then that helps you figure out what's what.
Exactly. And like we said before, it's not about, becoming some kind of statistics expert. It's more about just being aware so you can ask the right questions and, maybe spot those biases. And then you can decide for yourself, what to believe.
So to our listeners out there, the next time that you see a statistic, take a second.
Yeah.
Don't just accept it. Think about it. Think about William Sealy Gosset.
The brewer who revolutionized statistics.
That's right.
It's amazing.
And we'll see you next time.
You just listened to the podcast, Stories from the World of Science, written by Sasho Dolines.